Hey guys, tonight we are stepping into one of history's most unsettling rooms, the medieval sick room. A place where the cure was often more dangerous than the disease, where a physician's confidence was matched only by his catastrophic misunderstanding of how the human body actually worked, and where death visited so regularly that people began to dress for it. We are talking about the filthy, fascinating, and deeply human story of medieval medicine and the plague that broke it entirely. But before we sink into the muck and mystery of it all, take a moment to like this video if you find yourself genuinely enjoying the journey, and subscribe if you want more nights like this, calm, curious, and a little unsettling in the best possible way. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Let me know what you heard about this video, where in the world you are tuning in from right now, and what time it is where you are. It is always something special to know that people are settling in from Edinburgh to Istanbul to Sao Paulo, dimming their lights and letting history carry them somewhere else entirely. Now, find your most comfortable position, let your shoulders drop, and let us begin. Picture this: you wake up one morning in the year 1348, and something is wrong. Not wrong in the familiar way: a head cold, a sore knee, the dull ache of a hard week's labor. This is different. There is a heaviness behind your eyes that feels less like tiredness and more like something pressing inward. Your armpits ache with a deep, insistent throb. By midday, you notice a swelling beneath your jaw, tender and hot to the touch, the size of an egg. By evening, the fever has climbed so high that your wife is pressing cold cloths to your forehead and muttering prayers under her breath. By the following morning, the egg beneath your jaw has grown to the size of a fist, the skin over it stretched, dark and bruised, almost purple at the edges. You are frightened in a way that feels ancient, in the way that animals are frightened, purely and without logic. You send for a physician. He arrives, studies you from a careful distance, notes the swelling with a gravity that confirms your worst suspicions, and tells you something that, to his mind, is a perfectly rational explanation for everything you are experiencing. Your humors are out of balance, he says. Specifically, your blood, the sanguine humor, has grown corrupt and excessive. The treatment is obvious. You must be bled, perhaps also purged, perhaps also given a poultice of herbs to draw the bad air from your skin. He does not touch the swelling. He already suspects, from the look of it, that you are beyond the reach of his treatments. But he performs them anyway, because that is what medicine is in the year 1348. And because the alternative, admitting that he has no idea what is happening to your body or why, is not something the intellectual framework of medieval medicine allows. This is where we begin. Not with the plague, though that is coming, but with the world that existed before it. A medical world of extraordinary confidence built on extraordinary flimsy foundations. To understand medieval medicine, you have to understand a theory so old and so deeply embedded in Western thought that it survived for nearly 2,000 years without serious challenge. The theory of the four humors. It was not invented in the Middle Ages. It was inherited from the ancient Greeks, refined by a Roman physician named Galen in the 2nd century of the Common Era, and handed down through centuries of copying and commentary until it became not just a medical theory, but a complete philosophy of the human body. The theory worked like this. The human body contained 4 essential fluids, each corresponding to one of the 4 classical elements. Blood was warm and moist, associated with air, the season of spring, and a cheerful temperament, the sanguine type. Yellow bile was warm and dry, associated with fire, the season of summer, and a quick-tempered, ambitious nature, the choleric type. Black bile was cold and dry, associated with earth, autumn, and the melancholic personality. Phlegm was cold and moist, associated with water, winter, and the calm, sluggish, phlegmatic nature. When these 4 fluids existed in perfect balance, the person was healthy. When they fell out of balance, when one became excessive or another became deficient, or when the quality of a humor grew corrupt, disease was the result. The elegance of this system was also its great danger, because it was internally consistent. It explained everything. A patient with a fever had too much hot blood. A patient with a cold, phlegmy cough had an excess of phlegm. A melancholic depression could be traced to too much black bile. Every symptom had a humoral cause, and every humoral cause had a treatment aimed at restoring the balance. Bloodletting, the removal of what was believed to be excessive or corrupt blood, was the most common of these treatments by a very wide margin. Physicians had entire systems for deciding how much blood to remove, and from which part of the body, based on which organ was believed to be afflicted, and which humor was judged to be out of balance. Sometimes this meant opening a vein in the arm with a small blade called a phleem, and collecting the blood in a bowl while monitoring the color and consistency of what emerged. Sometimes it meant applying leeches directly to the skin near the site of pain. Leech jars were a fixture in every apothecary. The animals kept alive in water, ready to be pressed to flesh and allowed to feed until they swelled and dropped off. It would be tempting to laugh at this, and people do. But the impulse to dismiss medieval medicine as nothing but ignorant superstition misses something important. The physicians who practiced bloodletting were not stupid. Many of them were among the most educated people of their era, trained at prestigious universities, fluent in Latin and Greek, steeped in centuries of accumulated medical scholarship. The problem was not their intelligence. The problem was their epistemology, the way they understood what counted as evidence. They were working within a system that made sense to them, observing outcomes through a theoretical lens that confirmed their assumptions, and practicing what they genuinely believed was helping their patients. The reality, of course, was often the reverse. Bloodletting removed the body's capacity to fight infection at precisely the moment when that capacity was most needed. Patients who were already weakened by disease were further weakened by the removal of blood they could not spare. The practice continued long after the medieval period. George Washington, the first president of the United States, died in 1799, partly as a result of aggressive bloodletting performed by physicians who believed they were treating a throat infection. The last documented medical use of bloodletting for cardiac conditions persisted into the 1920s. 2,000 years is a very long time for a wrong idea to survive, and it survived because it was embedded in a system that felt complete, logical, and authoritative. Other treatments followed the same logic. Purgatives, substances that caused vomiting or diarrhea, were used to expel excessive humors through the digestive tract. Enemas were administered for similar reasons. Emetics were given to those whose excess was judged to sit in the stomach. Sweating therapies were prescribed to drive corruption out through the skin. Herbal remedies were prescribed in combinations designed to counterbalance whatever quality, hot, cold, wet, dry, the physician had decided was excessive in the patient's constitution. Some of these herbal remedies, it must be said, contained compounds with genuine pharmacological activity. Willow bark, which medieval healers used to reduce fever, contained salicylates, the active ingredient in aspirin. Foxglove, used in some traditions to treat heart weakness, contains digitalis, still used in cardiac medicine today. The empirical observation that certain plants produce certain effects sometimes pointed toward real biology, even when the theoretical explanation was entirely wrong. But the general thrust of medieval treatment was to intervene aggressively in a system that often needed nothing more than rest, nutrition, and time. Now let us talk about the physical environment in which this medicine was practiced, because the conditions of medieval life were themselves a kind of ongoing medical catastrophe. The filthy truth about medieval hygiene is that it was not quite as uniformly dreadful as popular imagination suggests, but it was bad enough. Medieval people did bathe. Public bathhouses existed in many European cities, and private bathing was practiced by those who had the means and the inclination. But clean water was genuinely difficult to come by. Sanitation infrastructure was primitive or non-existent, and the livestock that shared the physical space of medieval towns contributed a constant biological generosity to the streets and waterways. Rivers served simultaneously as water sources, sewage systems, and industrial dumping grounds. Tanneries disposed of their chemical waste directly into waterways. Slaughterhouses operated adjacent to the river, and the blood and offal flowed naturally downstream to wherever the next settlement drew its drinking water. Wells were dug in proximity to cesspits and graveyards, and the slow percolation of contaminated water through medieval soils was nobody's responsibility and therefore nobody's concern. The connection between dirty water and disease was simply not understood. The germ theory of disease, the idea that specific microscopic organisms cause specific illnesses, would not emerge for another 4 or 5 centuries. In the absence of that understanding, the physical world of medieval medicine was one in which patients were already immunologically challenged before the physician arrived, in which the tools of treatment were not clean between uses, and in which the hands touching wounds had touched earth and animals, and a dozen other patients, without any thought given to the transfer of invisible agents between them. Surgical instruments were reused without sterilization as a matter of course, not from carelessness, but from ignorance. The idea that a scalpel might carry something invisible from one body into another and produce infection in the second patient simply did not exist. Wounds were sometimes cleaned with wine or vinegar, and these practices did have some mild antiseptic effect, not because medieval practitioners understood why, but because empirical observation over generations had established that wounds treated this way tended to do slightly better than wounds left completely untreated. The figure of the medieval surgeon deserves particular attention because the practice of surgery in the Middle Ages occupied a strange and specific place in the social and intellectual hierarchy of medicine. In 1215, the Fourth Lateran Council issued a decree forbidding clergy from performing surgery. The reasoning was that surgery involved the shedding of blood, which was considered incompatible with the spiritual duties of ordained men. Since the great majority of educated physicians in medieval Europe were clerically trained, this decree created a practical problem. Who was to perform the cutting? The answer, over time, became the barber-surgeon. These were men who had already established themselves as skilled practitioners of the blade in the context of shaving and haircuts, and who gradually took on an expanding portfolio of medical procedures as the need presented itself. The same hand that held a razor could hold a fleam, could extract a tooth, could open an abscess, could amputate a limb. The red and white barber's pole that still hangs outside barbershops today is a direct visual legacy of this history. Red for blood, white for the bandages used after bloodletting, twisted together around a staff that represents either the stick patient's grip during the procedure or the basin used to catch the blood. Barber-surgeons could spend 7 to 9 years in apprenticeship, beginning as young as 13 or 14, learning their craft by watching and then gradually assisting with increasingly complex procedures. They were not unskilled. The best of them were remarkably capable within the constraints of what they understood and what they had available. But what they did not have and could not have had was anesthesia, not in any meaningful sense. The pain of medieval surgery was total. Alcohol could dull sensation somewhat, and opium preparations, expensive and unreliable, were used in some contexts. Mandrake root, which contains scopolamine and other compounds, was sometimes employed as a sedative, but none of these approaches came close to the controlled unconsciousness that modern general anesthesia provides. Patients undergoing major surgery in the Middle Ages were often simply held down by multiple assistants, while the procedure was performed as quickly as possible, speed being understood as a form of mercy, since it shortened the duration of agony rather than eliminated it. Amputation was performed on conscious patients. The surgeon would apply a tourniquet above the planned cut, work as rapidly as his skill allowed through skin and muscle, and eventually bone with a saw, and then deal with the bleeding stump through one of two methods: ligation, tying off the blood vessels with thread, or cauterization, pressing a red-hot iron against the wound to seal it with heat. The sound of this, the smell, the complete helplessness of the patient. These are things that historical distance tends to sanitize into abstraction, but they were physical realities that belonged to real people's bodies, and they deserve to be held in mind. And then, even if the surgery itself was survived, came the infection. Without any understanding of microbial contamination, without antibiotics, without the ability to maintain sterile conditions, post-operative infection was not a complication to be guarded against. It was an expected outcome that physicians tried to manage after the fact. Wound fever, as it was generically described, was so common as to be considered a normal part of the healing process. The pus that formed in infected wounds was sometimes interpreted as laudable pus, a positive sign that the body was expelling corruption. This was not entirely wrong as an observation. Some degree of suppuration could indicate that the immune system was active, but it led to deeply misguided interventions that actively encouraged the conditions favorable to lethal infection. Ergotism was one of the conditions that brought patients most frequently to the surgeon's table. This disease, caused by a fungal contamination of rye and other grains called ergot, produced powerful vasoconstriction, a narrowing of blood vessels that could cause gangrene in the extremities. Fingers, toes, entire hands and feet would turn black and die from lack of blood supply, requiring amputation. The condition was so associated with the burning, searing pain of gangrenous flesh that it was known as St. Anthony's Fire. During particularly bad harvest years, when contaminated grain entered the food supply of an entire region, towns and villages might see dozens of people presenting simultaneously with blackened, dying limbs. The fungal source of the contamination was not identified until the 17th century. For the medieval surgeon, it was simply one more inexplicable affliction of a body that seemed designed to fail. Into this world of four humors and bloodletting, of barber-surgeons and inadequate pain control, of contaminated water and post-surgical infection, came, in the autumn of 1347, something that made everything worse. The Black Death did not announce itself. It arrived on ships. The ships came from the eastern shore of the Black Sea, from a trading port called Kaffa, a Genoese colony in what is now Crimea, Ukraine. The city had been besieged by Mongol forces, and there is a story, recorded by a contemporary Genoese notary named Gabriele de Musis, that the Mongol army, itself suffering terribly from the plague, catapulted the bodies of their dead over the walls of the city as a form of biological warfare. Whether this specific detail is entirely accurate or somewhat embellished, what is certain is that the Genoese traders who fled Kaffa by sea in late 1347 carried the disease with them. The ships arrived at Messina in Sicily in October of 1347. The Sicilian port authorities took one look at the men aboard and ordered the ships to leave immediately. Most of the sailors were dead. Those still alive bore terrible swellings on their armpits, groins, and necks, and were covered with black blotches that signified bleeding beneath the skin. The ships were ordered to leave, but it was too late. The disease had already disembarked, invisibly, in the bodies of rats and the fleas that rode on them, and it had no intention of getting back on any ship. The bacterium responsible for what we now call bubonic plague is Yersinia pestis. It lives primarily in the bodies of small rodents and is transmitted between them and to humans through the bite of the oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopes. The flea acquires the bacterium when it feeds on an infected rodent, and when that rodent dies and the flea seeks a new host, it can transmit the infection to a human through its bite. The bacterium then travels through the lymphatic system to the nearest lymph node, where it begins to replicate with terrifying efficiency, causing the lymph node to swell dramatically, producing the characteristic bubo that gives bubonic plague its name. Without treatment, the infection spreads through the bloodstream and can reach virtually every organ in the body. There were other forms. Pneumonic plague that had spread to the lungs, was even more efficient, transmitted directly from person to person through respiratory droplets. A person with pneumonic plague could infect others simply by breathing near them. Septicemic plague, in which the bacteria reached the bloodstream in massive numbers, caused rapid systemic collapse and was almost universally fatal. The black discoloration of the skin that gave the epidemic one of its common names, the Black Death, resulted from subcutaneous bleeding as the body's clotting systems failed entirely. Mortality rates varied by location and conditions, but for untreated bubonic plague, they hovered somewhere between 30 and 60%. For pneumonic and septicemic plague, they were higher, approaching and sometimes exceeding 90% in some outbreaks. There was no treatment that worked. There was no treatment that even slowed the progression. People died within days of the first symptoms, sometimes within hours. The disease moved west through Europe with a terrible patience, from Sicily in October 1347 to mainland Italy and southern Spain by the end of the year, through France and into England and Central Europe through 1348, into Germany, Austria, and the Scandinavian countries through 1349 and 1350, into the far reaches of Northern Europe and the British Isles through 1351. By the time the first great wave subsided, somewhere between 25 and 50 million people in Europe alone were dead. Estimates vary, but the general consensus among modern historians is that approximately 1/3 to 1/2 of Europe's entire population was killed in the space of roughly 5 years. 1/3 to 1/2. Let that settle for a moment. Every third person you passed on the street, every second family in your village, every fourth house on your road, empty or soon to be. Children who had no parents, parents who had no children, farms without farmers, workshops without craftsmen, monasteries without monks, the institutional memory of generations, the accumulated knowledge of specific crafts and trades and agricultural practices, gone with the people who held it. In the face of this catastrophe, medieval medicine did what it always did. It looked for a humoral explanation, and it offered humoral treatments. Physicians prescribed bloodletting for plague patients, removing blood from people who were already dying of internal hemorrhage. They prescribed purgatives, weakening people who were already too weak to stand. They prescribed emetics, further dehydrating people who were already losing fluid through fever and inflammation. The treatments accelerated death rather than preventing it, and the physicians who administered them often died themselves before they could observe this. The dominant medical theory about how the plague spread was miasma, bad air. The idea that disease arose from and was transmitted by corrupt or putrescent atmospheric conditions had deep roots in ancient medicine and made a kind of intuitive sense in a world where rotting matter, stagnant water, and the smell of death were reliable predictors of sickness. Physicians noted that plague seemed to cluster around areas of decomposition and poor sanitation, which was accurate enough as an observation, since those were also the areas most hospitable to rats and fleas, but drew the entirely wrong conclusion about the mechanism. The miasma theory led to some interventions that were ineffective but relatively harmless, and some that were actively counterproductive. The burning of aromatic herbs and incense in sick rooms was practiced to purify the air. Camphor, juniper, lavender, rosemary, rue. People held bunches of flowers to their faces when forced to walk through infected areas. Fires were lit at street corners to drive away the bad air. The flagellant movements that arose during the plague years, processions of people flogging themselves publicly in penance, believing that the plague was divine punishment for sin, were psychologically understandable responses to an incomprehensible catastrophe, even if they spread the disease more efficiently among participants. What actually helped, in the ways that medieval society found to respond to the plague, was almost always something that worked through mechanism of physical separation, rather than through any medical treatment. The earliest and most important of these responses was quarantine. The history of quarantine as a formal public health measure begins in the Mediterranean port cities of the 14th and 15th centuries, and it begins in a remarkably rational place given how little was actually understood about disease transmission. The city of Ragusa, modern-day Dubrovnik, on the Adriatic coast, was, in 1377, the first city in recorded history to implement a formal quarantine for ships arriving from plague-affected areas. Ships were required to anchor offshore for a defined period before any passengers or cargo could be unloaded. The initial period was 30 days, called the Trentino, from the Italian for 30. Over time, the period was extended to 40 days, Quarantino, from quanta giorni, meaning 40 days, which is where our modern word quarantine comes from. The choice of 40 days was not arbitrary, though its precise origin is somewhat debated. The number 40 carried powerful biblical resonance. 40 days of the Great Flood in Genesis, 40 years of wandering in the desert, 40 days of Christ's temptation, 40 days of Lent. But it also happened to be, by empirical observation and a certain amount of trial and error, roughly sufficient to allow most infected individuals to either sicken and die or recover before they were permitted to enter the city. The incubation period for bubonic plague, the time between infection and the first visible symptoms, is typically somewhere between 2 and 7 days, but can extend to several weeks in some cases. A 40-day isolation period was long enough to catch nearly all active infections before they could be introduced into the general population. Venice, the great trading republic of the Mediterranean, went further. In 1423, the city established a permanent plague hospital, a lazaretto, on an island in the lagoon called Santa Maria di Nazareth. Sick travelers and those suspected of exposure were housed there, isolated from the mainland population, and either treated or held until they were no longer considered infectious. The name Lazaretto is itself a corruption of Nazaretto, the name of the island, a small linguistic accident that linked medieval plague hospitals to the story of Lazarus and became the standard European term for such facilities for centuries. These were genuine public health innovations, and they worked. Not perfectly, not consistently, and not based on any correct understanding of how the plague actually spread. But the physical separation of potentially infected individuals from healthy populations did slow transmission in measurable ways. Cities that implemented rigorous quarantine procedures consistently showed lower rates of plague mortality than cities that did not. The observation was made empirically, without any ability to explain it mechanistically, and it was retained and refined over successive plague outbreaks throughout the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries. Now let us talk about the plague doctor. The image of the plague doctor, the tall figure in the long waxed coat, the wide-brimmed hat, the gloves and boots covering every inch of skin, and above all, the long beaked mask with its dark glass eyepieces, is one of the most immediately recognizable images of medieval history. It has become so thoroughly associated with the Black Death in popular imagination that it seems almost impossible to separate the two. But here is the thing that surprises almost everyone when they first learn it. The iconic plague doctor costume was not medieval. It was not worn during the Black Death of 1347 to 1352. Not a single primary source from that period describes it. Not a single image from the 14th century depicts it. The earliest documentation of the plague doctor costume as a coherent protective ensemble is from the year 1619, more than 250 years after the first Great Plague pandemic. The costume was designed by a French physician named Charles Delorme, who served as personal physician to King Louis XIII. Delorme developed it not for the bubonic plague of the Black Death, but for subsequent plague outbreaks that continued to afflict European cities well into the 17th century. The costume came into widespread use during the Plague of 1656 and the Great Plague of Marseille in 1720. Only 2 original beaked masks are known to survive. Both are from 17th century Germany, now held in museum collections. So why do we picture plague doctors with beaked masks when we imagine the Black Death? Partly because plague itself continued to occur throughout the 15th, 16th, and 17th centuries, and the costume became iconically associated with the disease across all its outbreaks. Partly because the image is so visually arresting and strange that it clings to the imagination, and partly because popular culture collapses historical periods in ways that serve dramatic effect rather than chronological accuracy. What the plague doctor costume actually was, regardless of when it was first used, is a genuinely remarkable piece of protective technology for its era. And understanding it reveals more about the rational response to infectious disease than the ridicule often directed at it suggests. The long waxed coat, made of Moroccan goat leather or treated linen, coated with wax to create a smooth, non-porous surface, created a physical barrier between the physician's skin and the bodies of patients. The wax coating had a practical effect that the physician wearing it could not have explained in modern terms. It prevented flea adhesion. Fleas find purchase on fabric with teeth and hooks designed to grip fibers. A smooth, waxed surface offers them nothing to hold. A physician moving through a plague-infested household in a waxed leather coat was, without understanding precisely why, protected from one of the primary vectors of transmission. The gloves, boots, and full head covering served obvious physical barrier functions. The glass eyepieces prevented any contact between mucous membranes and potentially contaminated material. The beak is where things become most interesting. The hollow beak, approximately 6 inches long in most descriptions, was filled with aromatic substances, roses and carnations, lavender and peppermint, camphor and cloves, vinegar-soaked sponges, sometimes juniper and ambergris. The theoretical justification was the miasma theory. The beak was intended to filter and purify the corrupt air before the physician inhaled it. As a method of filtering air against bacterial infection, it was ineffective. Bacteria are far smaller than any aromatic material could block. But for pneumonic plague transmitted through respiratory droplets, the situation is different. Respiratory droplets are considerably larger than individual bacteria. A dense packing of aromatic material and a long beak provided some physical impediment to the inhalation of larger droplets. Not reliable protection by any means, and not nearly equivalent to a modern respirator. But not entirely without function either. The wooden cane carried by plague doctors was used to examine patients without touching them directly, to pull back clothing, to gesture, to move limbs for inspection, and to maintain the physical distance that plague doctors seem to have understood, at least intuitively, was safer than close contact. The physician who wore this costume in the 17th century was working from wrong premises. Miasma theory was incorrect, and the protective properties of the costume operated by mechanisms entirely different from those imagined. But they were not working irrationally. They were observing, empirically, that physicians who maintained physical separation from patients and covered their skin tended to survive longer than those who did not. The theoretical framework was wrong. The practical response, in many respects, was not. The cities of plague-afflicted Europe developed other practical responses over the generations of outbreak that followed the first Black Death. Infected households were marked, painted with a red cross, hung with straw, signified with colored cloth, so that passers-by could avoid them. Bodies were collected at night and carried to mass burial sites away from the center of populated areas. The movement of goods from infected cities was restricted. Markets were closed. Public gatherings were prohibited. Prices of essential goods were sometimes regulated to prevent the exploitation that predictably followed any disruption of normal commerce. None of these measures rested on correct theoretical understanding, but many of them worked, at least partially, by mechanisms that made sense in retrospect. Educing contact between infected and uninfected individuals, limiting the movement of rats and fleas hidden in traded goods, reducing the density of gatherings that facilitated respiratory transmission. The social collapse that accompanied plague epidemics is documented in chronicles from cities across Europe, and the picture that emerges is one of extraordinary psychological complexity. People responded to the Black Death in ways that ranged from profound selflessness to complete moral abandonment, often within the same community and sometimes within the same individual. Giovanni Boccaccio, the Florentine writer who survived the Black Death, and set his Decameron, a collection of stories supposedly told by young people sheltering from the plague in a country villa, against the backdrop of the epidemic, described Florence during the height of the outbreak with a clarity that still reads as immediate. Neighbors refusing to help neighbors. Parents abandoning dying children. People feasting and drinking, with a kind of desperate hedonism that said, if we are all going to die anyway, let us at least die pleasantly. But the same chronicles document acts of extraordinary courage. Physicians who continued to visit patients, knowing the likely consequences. Priests who administered last rites to thousands, knowing they would be among the last to receive them. Ordinary people who fed and cared for strangers because no one else was left to do it. The flagellant movement, which has already been mentioned, was one of the more dramatic collective responses. Processions of penitents, sometimes hundreds strong, moved from town to town through plague-stricken Europe, flogging themselves publicly with leather straps weighted with iron spikes, their backs raw and bleeding, singing hymns and calling on God to end the punishment he was clearly inflicting on a sinful world. The movement was officially condemned by Pope Clement VI, partly on theological grounds and partly, perhaps, because the processions were demonstrably helping the plague spread along their routes. But it persisted for years. Jews were accused of poisoning wells and were massacred in their hundreds in communities across Germany, France, and Spain, a pattern of scapegoating that followed a familiar historical logic. When something incomprehensible and lethal strikes, someone must be responsible, and the most vulnerable available minority will do. The pogroms of the Black Death years were not incidental to the epidemic. They were one of its consequences, as surely as the mass graves in the abandoned fields and the collapsed institutions. The collapse of the institutional church during the Black Death was particularly significant for subsequent medical history. The mortality among clergy, who were simultaneously more exposed to the dying through their pastoral duties and often concentrated in the close quarters of monastic life, was catastrophically high. An estimated 40 to 60% of the English clergy died. Similar figures have been estimated for France and Italy. The trained, literate, educated class that had provided the organizational backbone of medieval medicine was devastated. The replacement clergy that was urgently recruited in the aftermath of the epidemic were less well-educated, less rigorously trained, and less equipped to maintain the intellectual tradition they were inheriting. This degradation of institutional knowledge had effects that extended well beyond medicine, into law, agriculture, philosophy, and every other domain of organized human learning. But the Black Death also, paradoxically, helped create conditions for eventual change. The sheer scale of the death toll demonstrated, in a way that could not be explained away, that the existing medical tradition had completely failed. Four humors and bloodletting and miasma theory had not saved a single life. The plague had killed physicians and patients alike, indifferent to learning, indifferent to prayer, indifferent to social status. Something had to be wrong with the existing understanding. The challenge to Galenic medicine that would eventually produce the scientific revolution in biology and medicine was already germinating in the trauma of the mid-14th century. It would take another 2 centuries to flower. Through the anatomical work of Andreas Vesalius, who demonstrated in the 1540s that Galen's anatomy was based partly on animal dissection rather than human subjects, and was riddled with errors. Through the work of William Harvey, who described the circulation of the blood in 1628. Through Anton van Leeuwenhoek's discovery of microorganisms using an early microscope in the 1670s. Through the development of germ theory by Louis Pasteur and Robert Koch in the 19th century. But the long road that led to modern medicine began, in some sense, in the catastrophic failure of medieval medicine to prevent or treat the Black Death. What actually worked in the medieval response to plague, besides quarantine, teaches us something interesting about the relationship between correct theory and effective practice. Isolation worked, not because medieval authorities understood Yersinia pestis or its vectors, but because physical separation of the sick from the healthy interrupted transmission through whatever mechanism that transmission occurred. The people who fled cities during plague outbreaks and stayed in isolated rural areas until the epidemic passed had a better survival rate than those who stayed. Not because they understood they were escaping fleas and rats, but because they were, in fact, escaping fleas and rats. Herbal remedies that had antibacterial or antiviral properties did something, in the same way that willow bark tea reduced fever. The empirical observation that certain treatments help certain conditions sometimes pointed accidentally at real biological activity. Cleanliness, the washing of bodies, the removal of filth from streets and waterways, the burial of the dead, rather than leaving them to decompose in the open. reduced the environmental load of infectious organisms. Without anyone understanding, that is what it did. The stricter quarantine regimes of the Italian city-states, Venice, Genoa, Ragusa, produced measurably better outcomes than the chaotic free-for-all that prevailed in cities without organized public health responses. The organizational infrastructure for public health that would eventually become the modern system of disease surveillance and epidemic management was first assembled in these plague-ravaged Mediterranean port cities by pragmatic city administrators who were less interested in theoretical correctness than in keeping their trade networks functioning. The long story of medieval medicine and the Black Death is not simply a story of ignorance and failure. It is a story of human beings confronting genuine catastrophe with the tools they had: intellectual, organizational, technological, psychological, and both failing dramatically and, in some ways, responding with a creativity and pragmatism that laid genuine groundwork for what came after. The four humors were wrong. Bloodletting made the sick sicker. The plague doctor costume arrived 2 centuries too late for the first pandemic and was based on incorrect miasma theory. The flagellants spread the disease they were trying to stop. The pogroms were not just morally monstrous, but entirely pointless as public health measures. And yet, quarantine was invented. Lazarettos were built. Practical observation of what reduced mortality, separation, cleanliness, burning or burying the contaminated dead, was made and acted on. The intellectual tradition that had enshrined Galen for over 1,000 years was shaken, ultimately, loose. And the people who lived through the Black Death, 1/3 to 1/2 of the population of Europe, gone in 5 years, generated, in the survivors and their descendants, a reckoning with mortality and a curiosity about the body's actual workings that fed, eventually, into the intellectual ferment of the Renaissance and the scientific revolution that followed. The medieval physician who stood at your bedside in 1348, studying your swelling and recommending bloodletting, was not your enemy. He was doing his best with what he had and what he knew, in a tradition that had been authoritative for 15 centuries and had no reason, from inside itself, to doubt itself. The tragedy was not his personal failure. The tragedy was the gap between the confidence of the tradition and the actual complexity of the biological world, a gap that could only be closed through the accumulation of evidence and the willingness to let evidence challenge authority. That gap is, in some form, always with us. Every era of medicine has its bloodletting, its confident interventions performed on incorrect theoretical foundations, producing outcomes that seem reasonable through the lens of the prevailing theory, but look, in retrospect, like harm. What separates modern medicine from medieval medicine is not the absence of wrong beliefs, but the presence of mechanisms for identifying and correcting them. The controlled trial, the peer review, the systematic collection of outcome data, the willingness to abandon an intervention when the evidence turns against it. Medicine before those mechanisms was not irrational. It was reasoning, often skillfully, from premises that had not yet been tested against the full complexity of the biological world. And the complexity of that world, the invisible, extraordinary, lethal, tenacious, adaptable biological world, revealed itself in the middle of the 14th century with a patience and a force that 2,000 years of accumulated theory had absolutely no answer for. The plague also fundamentally altered the intellectual and spiritual relationship between Europeans and death itself. Before 1347, death was omnipresent in medieval life. Infant mortality was high. Famines were periodic. Warfare was constant, but it was understood through a theological framework that gave it structure and meaning. You died when God decided it was your time. The proper preparation was confession, last rites, and a death surrounded by community and prayer. The art of dying well, ars moriendi, was a genuine discipline with devotional literature devoted to it, instructing the faithful in how to approach their final hours in a state of grace. The Black Death broke that framework. It killed too fast and too indiscriminately for ars moriendi to apply in most cases. A person stricken on Tuesday was dead by Friday. Priests could not attend every deathbed. Confession was often impossible. Families abandoned dying relatives, sometimes through genuine terror of contagion, and sometimes through the psychological exhaustion of having already lost everyone else they loved. The promise that a well-managed death would smooth the passage to heaven became impossible to fulfill for hundreds of thousands of people, and the theological stress this created was profound. It fed into the fledgling movement already described. It fed into a flowering of religious art that became, in the aftermath of the Black Death, obsessed with death in a way that earlier medieval art had not been. The dance of death became one of the defining visual motifs of the late medieval period. It depicted death as a personified figure leading a procession of representatives from every social station: pope and emperor, bishop and knight, merchant and peasant, infant and ancient, all compelled by death's invitation to join the dance, regardless of wealth or station or virtue. The message was explicit and democratic in a way that medieval hierarchical society rarely permitted. Death came for everyone. Death recognized no privilege. This artistic preoccupation with mortality was not merely morbid. It was an honest reckoning with a biological fact that had recently been demonstrated at scale, and it planted, in the cultural imagination of Europe, a seed of skepticism about the guarantees of social hierarchy. The idea that wealth and station ultimately offered no protection against the things that really mattered, that would eventually contribute to the intellectual ferment of the 14th and 15th centuries. The massive die-off of the Black Death also produced economic consequences that reshaped European social structures in ways that no purely political force had managed. With perhaps a third of the population dead, labor suddenly became scarce. Scarce labor was valuable labor. Peasants who survived the plague found, for the first time in generations, that they had leverage. That lords who had always been able to replace any individual worker now could not simply do so. Wages rose. Serfdom, the system by which peasants were bound to the land of their lord with no freedom of movement and minimal compensation for their labor, began to crack under the pressure of demographic reality. The English peasants' revolt of 1381, the French Jacquerie of 1358, and various other popular uprisings of the late 14th century drew their energy, in part, from the new expectations generated by post-plague economic conditions. This is medicine's connection to politics. Through biology, the pathogen shapes the population shapes the economy shapes the political possibilities of an era. The Black Death did not cause the eventual dissolution of European feudalism, but it accelerated it in ways that no treaty or election or battlefield victory had managed. The bacterium Yersinia pestis, in the course of killing approximately 25 million people, rearranged the economic foundations of an entire civilization. It is worth dwelling for a moment on what the Black Death meant for the specific practice of medicine. Not just what it revealed about the inadequacies of existing treatments, but what it destroyed in terms of the people who practiced them. The university-trained physicians of medieval Europe were concentrated in cities, in cathedral schools, in monastic establishments. They were literate, they were relatively well connected to the tradition of Galenic medicine, and they died in enormous numbers. Florence lost physicians at rates that probably exceeded the general population mortality, partly because their professional obligations brought them into contact with far more plague victims than ordinary citizens encountered. The same was true of apothecaries, the pharmacists of the medieval world, who mixed and dispensed the herbal remedies and compound preparations prescribed by physicians. Apothecaries worked in the same physical proximity to the sick as physicians, with no more effective protection. The disruption of the networks through which medical knowledge was transmitted, apprenticeships, university training, the copying and distribution of medical texts, meant that the generation that came of age in the aftermath of the plague inherited a degraded version of an already inadequate tradition. This was not a recipe for rapid medical progress. In the short term, the Black Death made medicine worse. But the longer-term effects included the increased dissection of human cadavers, which began to be permitted in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, and expanded significantly in the generations after the plague. Direct observation of the human body, what was actually inside it, how the organs were arranged, what the blood vessels connected to what, was beginning to challenge the purely textual authority of Galen. Mondino de Lucy conducted public dissections in Bologna in the early 14th century. The anatomical tradition that would eventually produce Vesalius's revolutionary De Humani Corporis Fabrica in 1543 was rooting itself in the late medieval soil, fed in part by the catastrophic failure of textual medicine to prevent or explain the plague. The hospitals of medieval Europe also deserve a word, because their history complicates the picture of medieval medicine considerably. The great hospital foundations of the medieval period, the Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century, the Santo Spirito Hospital in Rome, the hospitals of Florence and Venice that would eventually become the model for early modern institutional medicine, were not primarily medical institutions in the modern sense. They were houses of charity, places where the sick poor could find shelter, food, nursing care, and spiritual administration when they had nowhere else to go. The care provided in these hospitals was largely custodial and palliative. Patients were housed together in large wards, often sharing beds when patient numbers exceeded capacity. The nursing was typically performed by religious women, beguines, sisters of various orders, who understood their work as a form of spiritual service and who provided what we might now call palliative care. The washing of bodies, the changing of dressings, the provision of food and water, the spiritual comfort of prayer and the sacraments. Medical treatment in the curative sense was secondary, and when it was administered, it was of the same humoral variety practiced everywhere else. But the custodial and palliative care provided by these institutions was not nothing. Rest, adequate nutrition, clean water, and attentive nursing care all supported recovery in patients whose conditions were, in fact, recoverable. Not through medical intervention, but through the body's own resources, given space and time and basic sustenance to work. The hospital mortality rates of medieval institutions, often cited as evidence of their inefficacy, reflect in part the fact that only the very sickest individuals, those for whom no home care was possible, were likely to end up there. When you control for severity of illness, the outcomes of medieval hospital care are somewhat more respectable. The religious nursing orders who staffed these hospitals were, in many cases, the most effective practical healers of the medieval world, not because they understood the mechanisms of disease, but because they understood, from long experience and from a spiritual tradition that valued the physical care of suffering bodies, which interventions made patients more comfortable, and which ones helped them maintain the physical resources to recover. This empirical wisdom, embedded in nursing practice rather than in the academic tradition of humoral medicine, was passed down through generations of religious communities and constitutes one of the genuine continuities of practical medical knowledge across the medieval period. The study of urine, uroscopy, was another practice that illuminates the simultaneously rational and mistaken character of medieval medical observation. Medieval physicians examined patients' urine with great care, observing its color, clarity, odor, and even, in some texts, its taste. They categorized these observations into elaborate typologies, each type corresponding to a specific humoral condition and pointing toward a specific treatment. As a system of diagnosis it was, of course, fundamentally limited by the wrong theoretical framework it operated within, but as an observation that the characteristics of urine could provide information about the state of the body that produced it, it was actually pointing in a scientifically defensible direction. Urine does carry biochemical information about the body. Glucose in the urine signals diabetes. Proteins signal kidney disease. Certain colors indicate specific metabolic conditions or the presence of blood. The empirical observation was correct even when the theoretical interpretation was not, and medieval physicians who became skilled at uroscopy were, in a real sense, doing a form of clinical observation that modern urinalysis has vindicated, just not in the way they thought. The connection between what medieval practitioners could observe and what they correctly concluded from their observations was, throughout the history of medicine, both more sophisticated and more confused than either wholesale dismissal or uncritical celebration allows. They were working at the edge of what careful human perception, unaided by instruments, can detect. And their conclusions were shaped by frameworks that made the data mean something, even when the meaning was wrong. And as the last lamp in the plague-emptied house finally goes dark, as the physician packs his instruments back into their bag and steps out into the abandoned street, you begin to understand something that the medieval world was slowly, painfully learning. That the body is not a text to be interpreted. It is a system to be understood. And the distance between those two things, between interpretation and understanding, is the distance between the 14th century and the laboratory, where 600 years later, the last secrets of Yersinia pestis are still being unpacked. If tonight's journey through the dark corridors of medieval medicine and the streets of plague-ridden Europe left you with something, a new appreciation for the invisible infrastructure of modern public health, a sense of the courage it took to practice medicine in a world where medicine mostly did not work, or simply a gratitude for the unremarkable miracle of clean water from a tap, then these stories have done something worth doing. Thank you so much for spending this time here. If you found this valuable, please consider leaving a like. It genuinely helps more people find these kinds of stories. And if you want to keep going, if you want more nights like this one, subscribe to History to Unwind. There is always another dark room to step into, another era to understand a little more honestly. Sleep well tonight, knowing that the world you are waking up into tomorrow is a stranger, more fragile, and more extraordinary place than it usually appears. Good night.